Hi folks, in this video I'm going to show you how to use mattress stitch to join the edges of two pieces of knitting. I'm Isolde, I'm a knitwear designer, and you can find my patterns and ebooks on our website isolde.com and on Ravelry. And we also have an online knitting community called The Knitwork, which you can find linked in the show notes down below. I'm Isolde on Instagram, and I always love to see your projects and what you're working on using my patterns or tutorials. So do make sure to tag me as Isolde so that I don't miss them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more knitting tutorials and tips and techniques. And if there's something specific that you would like to see me cover, do leave a note in the comments down below. We're going to use mattress stitch to join the vertical edges. You can also use a variation on mattress stitch to join a vertical edge to a horizontal edge, like a bind off, or to join two horizontal edges. I'll also be uploading accompanying videos showing the different variations so that you can join any piece of knitting to any other piece. I'm going to show you mattress stitch on two straight vertical edges. These edges don't have any shaping. You can use the exact same technique to seam together two edges that do have shaping, for example increases or decreases. I know seaming can be really intimidating, and a lot of knitters choose not to knit seamed garments or projects that require seaming. I get it. I personally love binding off and basically being done and being able to wear my new sweater. But seaming can give your garment more structure, and it can also be useful because it allows you to knit a big project like a sweater or a large oversized cardigan in smaller, more portable pieces, which I know I don't want to haul like a whole sweater on the bus. So that can be really handy. And I find that there's sort of two camps of knitters that avoid seaming, and maybe you fall into one of them. So there are knitters who know how to do it, can do it, don't want to sit down and seam, they like knitting, not sewing. Fair enough. The other camp is knitters who are nervous about seaming and are worried that maybe it's going to turn out messy, it's not going to look as polished as a seamless garment. There's no reason that has to be the case. I'm going to show you how to do a mattress stitch seam and also share some tips on how to make your seam look really beautiful and how to prepare your knitting so that when you come to seam it, it all goes smoothly. I'm guessing you're watching this tutorial because you've got some knitting that you need to seam together. So you probably don't need any extra supplies for this, but if you do want to follow along, I've got two basic stockinette stitch swatches here and some scrap yarn in a contrast colour. Usually when you're seaming, you'll use the same yarn that you knit your project with. There are some exceptions to that I'm going to cover later in this video in the tips section. But generally you'll use the same yarn, the same colour as your project was worked in. I'm only using a contrast colour so that you can see my stitches and see what I'm doing more clearly. And I've also got a blunt darning needle. The size of your needle kind of depends on the size of your yarn, the size of your stitches. This is quite a large one. Doesn't need to be this big, but you do want to make sure that you can easily thread your yarn through the eye of the needle. Otherwise the size isn't too important. If you got lucky or you've planned ahead, you might have a long tail of yarn attached to one corner of the pieces you want to join, maybe from your cast on or bind off. If you do have that, go ahead and work your seam with that. As a rule of thumb, you want to make sure that your length of yarn is at least 1.5 times the edge that you're going to join your seam, plus enough to weave in the ends. So about 6 inches, 15 centimeters extra. If you need to cut an extra length of yarn, you'll want 2 of those extra lengths. So about 12 inches, 30 centimeter plus 1.5 times the length of the seam. So I've got one, it's about 1.5, and that's probably a little bit more than 12 inches, but that's fine. The first step is to join the very bottom edges together neatly and anchor the yarn. If you're using a separate piece of yarn like I am, this will also join that piece of yarn. So what I'm going to do is go under my swatch, or under my piece of knitting, and just above the cast on edge, sort of next to the first row of actual stitches, I'm going to go in between the first and second stitch and through the fabric from back to front. I'm going to pull that through until I've got about a 6-inch, 15 centimeter tail, enough that at the end I can weave that in. I'm just going to leave it loose for the moment. This figure of 8 stitch will anchor it securely, but when I come to weaving that end at the end, I'll be able to slightly adjust the tension of my seam if I need to. So it can be helpful to leave that loose. And then this is where the figure of 8 comes in. We're going to go across and then in between my 2 pieces of fabric, and then up through the other corner on the other piece of knitting in the exact same way. So in between the first and second stitch on the first row from back to front, and then down in between those swatches and back up from back to front through the sort of space where you went the first time through that hole. You can see why it's called a figure of 8 stitch. And then I can pull on both ends to snug those edges up together nice and tightly. We'll tighten it up at the end, so don't worry that this is visible for the moment. Obviously, if your yarn is already joined to your knitting because it was your cast on tail, for example, then you'll want to pull that nice and securely. Now we're going to work our first stitch for our mattress stitch. Before I actually work the first stitch, I want to show you the sort of structure of the fabric. So if I take kind of hold of my first column of knit stitches here, they're kind of curling under and you can only see half of them until I unfold it. And I pull that apart from the next column. So there's a little ladder here, and it's that ladder, those bars of yarn between the stitches, that we're going to focus on with our mattress stitch. I'm going to take my needle across to the other edge. I'm going to go into it from the front this time, where I did my figure of 8 stitch, and then I'm going to run my needle under and count 2 of those bars. So that's 1, 2, I'm going to go under 2 and then come up back through the right side of the fabric. And don't worry about pulling it tight yet. And then I'm going to go across to my other side and do the same thing. So go in where you did your figure of 8 stitch and then back up under 2 bars. We're going to do the same thing again. So you're always going back in where your yarn came out the last time. So back in here and then under 2 bars, back through to the right side. One reason that we use a blunt tapestry needle for this is that you're less likely to actually go through the yarn of your fabric. It's not a huge problem if you do, but sometimes if you're kind of tensioning the yarn in your seam, you could distort those stitches or cause a snag. So it's good to have a blunt needle, and your aim is to go sort of around the yarn in your knitted fabric and not through the yarn. So back across to this side, under 2 bars, and across to this side. And then once you've done a few stitches like this, you want to give the yarn a nice tug, not too tightly. And I'm just going to tighten up my anchoring figure of 8 at the bottom here as well. And then you can see that your seam really disappears. This almost looks like one piece of knitted fabric. Even when I'm using a contrasting color, you can see it a little bit on that bottom edge, but otherwise it's totally disappeared. So you want to do that every few stitches. You'll kind of get a feel for what feels like the right amount of tension and how often you need to pull the yarn tight. It'll depend a bit on the yarn you're using. And then continue in this manner. One reason I'm not pulling it really tight after each stitch is that it makes it easier to see what you're doing for the next stitches if it's not really tight. And you can see as I go, I'm kind of just using my left hand. I'm right-handed. You could obviously reverse this if you're left-handed, but I'm using my left hand to kind of hold the 2 pieces of fabric and open up these stitches if I need to see the bars. I'm going to keep a nice hold of what I'm doing. When you get close to the top, hopefully everything's lined up. If you have the exact same number of rows in each of your pieces, it should do. And you might find that you only have 1 bar left. That's fine, just go under that 1 bar on each side. And then what I like to do usually for finishing it off is I'll bring the needle sort of through the edge, through the bind off edge on both sides. and pull those together smoothly. And then generally I'll go back in kind of to the wrong side through the bind off edge, and then I've got two ends that I can weave in. Before you weave in the ends, it's a good idea to kind of check your tension. So you want to be able to stretch your seam. You can see here I've got a nice amount of stretch. That's going to mean that if this was a sweater or a hat or anything I'm going to put on a body, that when I'm stretching it out of shape to put it on my body, that yarn in my seam isn't going to be under so much tension that it snaps. You don't want seams that are going to come undone. And if I pull it too tight, I'm not sure how much this yarn is going to show me. Oh yeah, that works. If I pull it too tight, that's actually when I'm most likely to get messiness. My stitches here are getting kind of squashed, out of shape and puckered, and that doesn't look very nice at all. So you want to make sure you're not pulling it too tight. It's way more likely that you're going to make your seam too tight than too loose. As soon as the yarn kind of disappears, the seam disappears, that's probably tight enough. So if it is too tight, you can kind of work your way along. You might need to get your darning needle involved, but that looks okay to me. And then you can finish up by weaving in your ends. On the wrong side, you can see the seam does create a ridge because you're turning effectively one column of knit stitches on each side under to the wrong side. That ridge helps to give structure to your garment. You're sort of adding a stronger point in the fabric that helps hold the fabric in shape. But there are times where you might not want as much of a ridge, or you might want to use a different technique, whether that's working your garment seamlessly or a different kind of seam to reduce that bulk. If your yarn is really delicate, maybe it's a sort of lofty woolen spun and it breaks easily, or it's something that's just hard to sew with, like mohair or something fluffy, you can absolutely use a different yarn for your seams. Sock yarn works well because it's strong and smooth, but still has some elasticity, and as long as it's a sort of coordinating color, it's not going to show through on the right side. Even with this highly contrasting color, I have to really tug at my seam to see any show through from that. You can also use a different yarn if the yarn you used for your project is really bulky. Using something thinner, again a sock yarn or maybe a smooth like sort of DK worsted weight, will work really well and help to reduce that bulk. You can also work your seam by going just half a stitch in from the outer edge rather than a whole stitch as I showed you. To do that, if I come over here, rather than pulling apart the first two columns of stitches, you'll sort of pull apart the first stitch and you'll be going into the center of one stitch and then up 2 rows above. The other things that you can do to make your seams go more smoothly and get a neater result are all actually things that happen before you start seaming, the kind of prep work for your project. If you're following a seamed pattern, hopefully it kind of sets you up well to do the seams and does this stuff anyway. But a few rules of thumb. Don't slip your selvage stitches. That makes a really lovely neat edge when your finished edge is that finished edge. If you're going to seam the edges together, you don't want to do that because it can distort the next stitch over, and that's the stitch that's going to be visible on our finished project. If I look at my seam here, the stitches I can see are the second column in. I can't see that first stitch, so you want the second column to be as neat as possible, and generally slipping the first stitch won't achieve that. In the same vein, you want any stitch patterning or increases or decreases to happen at least one stitch in from the edge. So if you have, for example, a knit purl pattern, an all over pattern, you'd still want one stitch at either side of your project, one column to all be in stockinette. Or if you're shaping maybe a raglan for a sweater, you want those decreases to happen at least one stitch in from the edge. Often more than one can look better because then you have a sort of selvage stitch once you've seamed things together that's visible between your seam and your decreases. It'll make things a bit easier if when you're casting on for something that will be seamed, if you remember to leave a long enough tail to work the seams, then you won't have to join in another piece of yarn and you won't have quite as many ends to weave in, which is always a bonus as far as I'm concerned. This is just a little piece of yarn, but If yours is too long and it's tangling, or you're worried that when you start knitting, you're going to start knitting with the tail rather than the ball end, you can just wrap it into a little butterfly and tuck the end in. And that'll sort of secure your yarn hanging out waiting for you to seam it without it getting tangled. It'll also make your seaming easier if you keep track of how many rows you're working, especially if you're doing separate pieces, so like a back and a front, if you're doing a sweater. Making sure that you have matching row counts will make the seaming easier. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you feel more confident tackling projects with seams. A lot of it is more about feel than exactly following the right steps, so it will take a bit of practice and you'll gain confidence as you do it, but it should open up a whole wealth of patterns that haven't previously been available to you. So I'm excited about that for you. Let me know in the comments how you got on with this tutorial and maybe what you're seaming, what projects you're seaming. I always like seeing your projects. Don't forget to subscribe so that you see my next tutorial, and I look forward to seeing what you're working on.